What's going on, guys, and welcome to today's Deck Tech on the Wise Mothman, hosted by me, Darth Centralis. So before we get into the stats of the deck and all of the cards, first we got to go over the commander. So the Wise Mothman is a 4-mana, 3/3 flyer, and whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, each player gets a rad counter. Now, a rad counter is very specific to Fallout, and basically what it means is at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, based on however many rad counters you have, you'll mill that many cards, and then for each non-land card that was milled, you lose a life and then you remove that many rad counters. Now, the Wise Mothman also has a second ability, so whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, you put a 1/1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. So basically, if it's your pre-combat main phase and you have 3 rad counters, you mill 3 cards. If 2 of them were non-land cards, you'll lose 2 life, you'll remove 2 rad counters, and then the Wise Mothman triggers its second ability, and you'll put a 1/1 counter on 2 target creatures because you had 2 non-land cards milled this way. So, very powerful commander. I think it's a lot of fun. So let's go over the rest of the deck. Alright, so going over the stats of the deck is pretty even based on creatures and non-creatures. So there's 27 creatures total in the deck, which is good because you want to have something to put those counters on. There's 11 instants, there's 7 sorceries, 12 artifacts, 8 enchantments, a planeswalker, and then there's 35 lands. And then based on those numbers, ramp, we also have about 12 pieces of ramp and then 12 pieces of card draw. I usually try to keep it between 10 and 12. So 12 is kind of on the high end, but I like that number for this deck. And then removal is at 9. I usually try to have between 9 to 10 pieces of removal, or at least interaction, so you can interact with what your opponents are doing. 2 board wipes. I usually try to put 3. This time I thought 2 would probably be pretty good because, you know, you're going to have a lot of creatures on the board. You'd not necessarily want to be the one that's wiping it, so 2 I kind of like there. Rad counters and proliferate, which is what the basis of what our deck wants to do, is we want to make rad counters, and then based on the fact that our commander is continuously making rad counters, we can proliferate, which is basically making rad counters as well. It just kind of enhances what our commander is already trying to do. And because we're milling a bunch and our opponents are going to be milling, we want to have, you know, a good amount of recursion. So we got 9 pieces of recursion and then 8 mill cards to basically, you know, when our commander eventually gets taken out, we can still be milling and keep all the other cards in our deck still functioning. We have 5 win cons / big mana plays. Obviously, you got a lot of creatures. You're going to be putting counters on them. That's definitely a win con. A lot of the creatures in the deck are also evasion based, so they have flying. So putting counters on them is definitely a way to go. You could definitely win through combat. But if you are the type of person that's like me and doesn't like winning through combat, there are some spells in the deck that will help you with that. And then I put utility down as 2 just because, you know, there's some cards that don't necessarily synergize with the deck, but they're fun cards to have. They'll do stuff in the deck, so we'll get into that when we get there. So the first category we're going to go over is the ramp cards. Obviously, we're going to have Soul Ring, we're going to have Arcane Signet. Fallout had really cool art versions of these cards, so there's just no point in not putting them in the deck. I think they look awesome, so we got those. They also had the talismans with new art in them, so of course we have the 3 talismans in this deck. We have a Farseek, we have Nature's Lore, we have Rampant Growth, you know, cards to help us on turn 2 put more lands into play. And then some cool ramp cards that I really like for this deck. Kamiya Whispered Hopes is a neat one. Whenever one or more counters are put on a permanent you control, you put that many +1, so it's really working with our commander. And then you can also tap it to add X mana of any one color, where X is its power, which in this deck could get pretty chaotic because your commander will be putting counters on things. It could put it on this, and then you could tap this, and yeah, it could get out of hand. Tato Farmer is pretty cool. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may get 2 rad counters, so it's helping with our rad counter theme of wanting to get rad counters. And then you could tap it to put a target land card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control tapped. Now, it doesn't have to be your graveyard, so if one of your opponents mills a land card and you're like, ooh, I really want that one, you could tap this and basically steal their land, which I think is pretty sweet. Head Shredder, I think, is one of those MVP cards in this deck because it's just that awesome. Whenever Head Shredder attacks, you may mill 2 cards, and then its best ability is whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped. So if for any reason we have like 6 rad counters and we mill 6 cards and hit 4 lands, all 4 of those lands are going onto our battlefield tapped. I think that's awesome. Like, that's a great ramp spell for 4 mana, especially when we're going to be milling cards. I mean, it's fantastic. We don't even have to attack with this. Its first ability of attacking you milling 2 cards does not matter whatsoever. Its last ability of, you know, just get those lands onto the battlefield whenever you mill them is just great. And so now we're going to go into draw. Some really fun draw cards I like in this deck. So the first one is Polywog Prodigy. It has evolved, so whenever a creature with greater power or greater toughness enters battlefield under control, you put a 1/1 counter on it. But whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than Polywog Prodigy's power, you draw a card. So obviously, this is a creature we're going to want to target with our +1/+1 counters from our commander, because if this thing gets to like 4 or 5 power, basically whenever our opponents cast a non-creature spell, we draw a card. And it's such a good rate for 2 mana that it has to go in the deck. Marcus Mutant Mayor is another one from the Fallout. And whenever a creature you control does combat damage to a player, you draw a card if it has a 1/1 counter on it. If not, you put a 1/1 counter on it. So obviously our creatures are going to have 1/1 counters on them. They're going to be hitting, and we're going to be drawing cards. Bred for the Hunt, very similar. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter deals damage to a player, you may draw a card. One of my favorite cards for drawing in this deck, Danny Pink. Creatures you control have whenever 1 or more counters are put on this creature, for the first time each turn, you draw a card. So you just put a counter on a creature, you draw a card. Likewise, Fathom Mage and Fetid Gargantua, glad I said that correctly. Whenever you put a counter on those creatures, also, you draw a card, Fathom Mage, and then Fetid Gargantua, you draw 2 cards. Now, you do lose 2 life, but 2 cards for 2 life, I think that's pretty good. Even on our opponent's turns, if they have rad counters and they're milling, and then we're putting counters on things. So basically, like, on everyone's turn, we're drawing a card. These are just great draw spells. Following along with that, so we have Guardian Project, because, you know, we got 27 creatures in the deck. It's a good amount of creatures. Whenever we play a creature, we draw a card. Struggle for Project Purity is an amazing, very fun card I like in this deck. I really like the Brotherhood option in this, which is at the beginning of your upkeep. Each opponent will draw a card, but then you draw a card for each card drawn this way. Now, it is an upkeep trigger, so you're going to draw 3 cards if you have 3 opponents, and then you're going to draw for turn. So you draw 4 cards on your turn for each 1 card your opponent drew. Mirelurk Queen is another one. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, you draw a card and then put a 1/1 counter on Mirelurk Queen. Ability triggers only once each turn. So not just your turn, each turn. So again, your opponent's mill a non-land card, take a damage, you put a 1/1 counter on Mirelurk Queen, you draw a card, and then, oh, you have Fathom Mage out too? Cool, you put a counter on that, draw a card. Like, it's insanely amount of card draw that you can get out of this deck. Final 2 card draw spells that I'll put under here. Contaminated Drink, so draw X cards, then you get half X rad counters rounded up. I really like this card because it's an instant. I normally won't put an X type of spell in a deck, because a lot of them are sorceries, but I really like the instant speed ones because you can just hold up your mana and then go through a whole turn rotation, and then before it gets back to you, you can then just waste all your mana, draw all those cards. So I really like instant speed X spells. I think they're great. I really like this one because it also gives you the rad counter, so it's very synergistic. And then Vault 87 Forced Evolution. Normally I don't put a spell like this in a deck because it's 5 mana, and it, you know, you gotta wait a couple turns before you get that final ability. However, we are going to be proliferating a lot in this deck, so you could play this and then proliferate a couple of times. You get all the advantages of the card in 1 turn. So based on that, I thought it was a pretty good include to get all of those abilities when you could do it on 1 turn. So basically, for this to be a draw spell, you draw cards equal to the greatest power among mutants you control. The next category is removal, so we just have some standard counter spells. So we have Arcane Denial, counter spell, pretty good. Sink into Stupor, I love these types of cards. So first of all, it can be a land, but you can have it enter the battlefield untapped by paying 3 life. But I also like it if you get it early, you play it for a land. If you want to keep it as removal or something, or a gotcha card, I love gotcha cards. This one's fun. So return target spell or non-land permanent opponent controls to its owner's hand. With that, so we have Assassin's Trophy. It's just one of the best 2 mana, get rid of a permanent spells. Atomize, I really like. Destroy target non-land permanent, and then you proliferate. So it follows with the synergy of the deck, and you're destroying something. Normally, I don't like playing removal that is like above 3 mana, but again, it's a Fallout deck. We want to play Fallout cards. This one's pretty good because it synergizes and you're still destroying something, so that's why it's in here. Lethal Scheme I like because you can convoke, destroy target creature or planeswalker. You could basically cast this for 2 mana, and then you also get a benefit if you convoke, because then your creatures connive. And then our final one, I really like these cards. Canker Bloom is great because you can play it early, and opponents I know hate it when you have destroy on a creature or an enchantment or something that you can just sacrifice and destroy something. So people will be really hesitant to be playing an artifact or enchantment that they think that it will get destroyed if they play it. So a lot of times they'll just hold on to it. And if you get to a point where you're like, all right, I need to proliferate, you just pay 1 sack, it proliferate. So it's very synergistic, can be removal. Vats is another one. Again, it's 4 mana, but it's a Fallout card. I really like it. It also has split second, so it's very hard to interact with it because nothing can go on the stack after this has been cast. You choose any number of target creatures with equal toughness, destroy the chosen creatures. So it can get rid of more than one thing, which is pretty cool. And then Vraska, Betrayal Sting. I put this under removal because I really like its -2 ability. So you can pay 5 and then pay 2 life, or you can pay 6. And it does have a 0 where you draw a card and you lose a life and then you proliferate, which again is very synergistic with the deck because we want to proliferate and we get to draw a card. So it's a great ability. But it's -2. You basically turn a creature into a treasure token. So there's a lot of creatures out there that maybe they've indestructible. Maybe they have something else that's going on. You could turn somebody's commander into a treasure token. All right, and then for our 2 board wipes, of course, we have Nuclear Fallout because it's Fallout, and it has Fallout in the title, and it's a Fallout card. It's just completely synergistic with the deck. So each creature gets twice -X/-X until end of turn for whatever you put into X, and then each player gets X rad counters. So it's just super synergistic. It's a board wipe. And of course, Toxic Deluge, all creatures get -X/-X based on how much health you pay. All right, so now we're going to get into kind of the meat of the deck. What our deck wants to do is make rad counters. It wants to proliferate. It wants everybody to be having rad counters. So here are the cards that I really like, minus the ones that we've already talked about that give rad counters and proliferate. So Vexing Radghoul, whenever it deals combat damage to a player gets 2 rad counters if they don't have any rad counters. Otherwise, you proliferate. Thrumming Bird is kind of right there with it. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. Whining Constrictor, whenever one or more counters will be put on an artifact creature you control. So it basically doubles your +1/+1 counters. But then it also will give you an extra rad counter, which is really good because obviously we're going to be recurring things from the graveyard. Milling our own deck is pretty good. We get twice that many of that. One of my favorite cards in this deck, Dreamtide Whale. I really like this card. It's 3 mana, 7/5 with Vanishing 2. So what Vanishing 2 is, you put 2 Vanishing counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a Vanishing counter, and once it has no Vanishing counters left on it, it basically goes away, it dies. But in this deck, we're proliferating quite a bit, and there's Proliferate on this card. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, you proliferate. It's just like everybody's going to be casting 2 or more spells, and it's whenever a player, so you can keep proliferating too. So it's a very, very good card in this deck. I really like it. Evolution Sage, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you proliferate. And then Flux Channeler, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. Now, I did say before we have 27 creatures in this deck, but we also have about 30 to 35 non-creatures in this deck. So we have a very balanced creature to non-creature ratio. Some other creatures that will help with rad counters. So Infesting Radroach, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many rad counters. So if you're putting +1/+1 counters on this, say it's at 5 and you hit somebody for 5, they get 5 rad counters. And then a couple of big hitters in this deck. Screeching Scorch Beast. Whenever it attacks, each player gets 2 rad counters. Whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, doesn't have to be from you, it could be your opponents, you make that many 2/2 black zombie mutant creature tokens. Do this only once each turn. Your opponents go to their first main phase, they have to mill 3 cards, 2 of them are non-lands, you make a 2/2 black zombie mutant. Goes to your next opponent, they have to mill 3, again 2 are non-lands, you make 2 more, goes to your next opponent, you get the idea at this point. So you're making 6 zombies by the time it gets back to your turn. Plus you're putting 1/1 counters on things. So Screeching Scorch Beast, because of that second ability, I really like it in this deck. And then Agent Frank Horgan, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you proliferate twice. I like it for 2 reasons. One, it has indestructible as long as it attacks this turn. So it doesn't really have evasion, but it's also really hard to kill, and because it's an attack trigger, not a combat damage trigger, I like it because you can attack, gains indestructible, you're going to proliferate twice before anything else happens with combat damage. We also have a few other rad counters cards. So Nuke Launcher, it gives the creature +3/+0 and has Intimidate, so it's really hard to block. And then whenever the equipped creature attacks, until the end of the defending player's next turn, that player gets 2 rad counters whenever they cast a spell. So again, it's adding to my rad counters. Inexorable Tide, whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. I mean, that's just insane. You're going to be proliferating so much with this card. And then Vault 12, the Necropolis. Again, it's a 6 mana saga. Its first ability is each player gets 3 rad counters. Create X/2/2 black zombie creature tokens on turn on the second chapter, where X is the total number of rad counters among players. And then its last ability is put 2/1 counters on each creature you control. It's a zombie or a mutant. And then finally, for rad counters, we have Rad Storm. I love it because it's an instant, so if another one of our opponents casts 3, 4, 5 spells on their turn and wants to pass the turn, we cast this and we get 5 copies of it. We're going to proliferate 6 times. So we have a couple of protection spells in this deck. Ripples of Potential, Proliferate, then you choose any number of permanents you control that had a counter put on them this way. Those permanents phase out. So again, it can help with board wipes. And we're putting 1/1 counters on basically all of our creatures. So it's going to be able to phase them all out. Protection from a board wipe. Mutational Advantage is kind of the same thing. Permanents you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until the turn. Prevent all the damage that would be dealt to those permanents. And then you proliferate. So it's very synergistic because they're proliferating, but then they're also saving our boards, which is really, really nice. All right, and then the next category is Recursion. Now I had to put Crucible of Worlds in. This is just amazing art. It's Fallout, it's Crucible of Worlds. I really like it. You play lands from your graveyard. Obviously we're gonna be milling, so it's really nice to be able to play those lands. Muldrotha of the Gravetide. During each of your turns, you may play a land and cast a permanent spell of each permanent type from your graveyard. It's just a fantastic card. There's no way I couldn't include it in the deck. Evolution Witness, I love this card in this deck. 3 mana whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Evolution Witness, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Our opponents mill a non-land card. We put a 1/1 counter on this, we get a permanent from our graveyard back to our hand. So it's such a good recursion in this deck, especially since a lot of our permanents are creatures, artifacts, enchantments, planeswalker, lands. Like, we can get so much back. Raoul Troubleshooter. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from 1 card in your graveyard that were milled this turn. So again, at our start of our pre-combat main phase, we have to mill with our rad counters, and that just gives us 3, 4, 5 additional cards that we can target to play this turn. And we don't have to pay any like additional costs. It's just you can cast one of those spells. So it's like having a free card in our hand. Master Transcendent, I was very on the shelf about this card. I put it in the deck just because I want to see how it works and see how good it actually is. So when it enters the battlefield, target player gets 2 rad counter. And then it has a tap ability. Put target creature card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control. It's a green mutant with base power and toughness 3/3. So again, you can steal your opponent's creatures with this, which is what I really like about the card. The thing I don't like about it is that you have to wait a whole turn cycle to be able to tap it. So unless we put like Swiftfoot Boots on it or something, this card's just sitting there on the table, not doing anything for a turn. So we'll see how it goes. I might switch up the deck later. Maybe I'll switch something out for this card. And of course, the biggest thing with our commander is milling, so of course we got to put some additional mill cards into our deck. The best ones, Ruin Crab is very good. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 3 cards. Mesmeric Orb, kind of broken with this deck. So Mesmeric Orb, whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. It doesn't say whenever permanents become untapped. So every permanent that becomes untapped puts a trigger on the stack. If we untap 5 cards, it's not 1 trigger of 5 mills. It's 5 triggers of 1 mill. So our commander is going to get really gross because it's going to see each one. And so we're going to get 5 counters on 5 different creatures. Anything else in the deck that cares about 1 or more counters getting put on, it's going to trigger 5 times, not once. So each of those triggers are going to go on the stack 5 times, not once. There's also triggers for our opponents. So this card, I think, is probably the MVP. It's very annoying to play against because people don't like milling, but obviously we're playing a mill deck, so we have to do the mill thing. Mind Crank, whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Now, of course, they've ratted that to say mill. They mill that many cards. Again, our rad counters that we're putting on people, they lose life when they mill non-land cards based off of that. Again, they have 3 rad counters. They mill 2 non-lands, they lose 2 life. Well, guess what? Now they're going to mill 2 more cards, and that's a separate trigger. Bruvak, the Delinquent, I don't know how to say that. If an opponent would mill 1 or more cards, they mill twice that many cards instead. The interesting thing with this is with your commander, if they have 3 rad counters, they're going to mill 6 cards. And if they have 4 non-land cards hit the graveyard, they're going to lose 4 life. So it's not for every rad counter. It's for every non-land card. All right, so some of the alternate win con / big spells that we have in this deck. So of course, Bloodchief Ascension is no joke in this deck. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on Bloodchief Ascension. Shouldn't be that hard when they're milling and then losing life based on the mills. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if Bloodchief Ascension has 3 or more quest counters on it, you may have that player lose 2 life. If you do, you gain 2 life. A new card that I really like, it's a room card, is Polluted Cistern and Dim Oubliette. So Polluted Cistern, whenever 1 or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, each opponent loses 1 life for each card type among those cards. So again, if you're milling 4 cards, you mill like a instant, creature, sorcery, land, all your opponents lose 4 life. And then it also has the recursion ability on it for 5 mana, so you can pay an additional 5 mana to open up that room. And when you do, you get to basically return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sir Conrad, of course, has to be in the deck. It does everything that you want to do. It also mills for 2 mana, so it's got to go in the deck. And then 2 really big win con / big spells. Breach the Multiverse, really like it. Each player mills 10 cards. And then for each player, you just get a planeswalker or a creature from their graveyard. And you put them under your control. For 2 mana more, Rise of the Dark Realms will just put all the creatures from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your controls. Alright, and then going to the utility, so cards that don't really fit into one of those categories, or it fits into all of them if you're the Great Henge. So Swiftfoot Boots, equip creature has Hexproof and Haste, equip 1, like, our commander's gonna be targeted. You know, we want to give things haste that can tap, so Swiftfoot Boots I really like. Glowing One I think is a very good card in this deck. So it has Death Touch, it's a 2/2. Whenever Glowing One deals combat damage to a player, they get 4 rad counters. So it could have went into the rad counter category, but I don't really think you're going to be dealing combat damage to a player with this because you want it to live. Whenever a player mills a non-land card, you gain 1 life. It basically makes it so we don't lose any life from our rad counters, and then every one of our opponents, if they lose life from the rad counters, we're gaining life. And not only that, if they're milling any other way, they mill a non-land card, we gain life. So this card is very good. And then of course we have the Party Tree, aka the Great Henge. It satisfies every single thing we want to do in this deck. I had to include it. So again, it costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, which shouldn't be too hard because we're putting counters on things. You get tapped to add 2 green, so it ramps. You gain 2 life. Whenever a non-token creature enters battlefield under your control, you put a 1/1 counter on it, which we like, and we draw a card. So again, it does the same thing as some of our other draw spells, but it's ramp. It puts counters on things. We can cast it for cheap. It draws cards. It does everything we want. All right, a couple of utility lands that we have in this deck as we get into the end of this with lands. Mariposa Military Base. I like it because you can have it enter tapped. If for any reason you don't need the mana, you just want to get 2 rad counters. Sure, but what I really like about this is it's 5 mana tap, draw a card. It costs 1 less to activate for each rad counter you have. So if we have 5 rad counters, we can just tap this to draw a card. Along with that, Karn's Bastion, again, had to go in the deck because it's a 4 mana tap, proliferate. We're going to want to proliferate in this deck. It just does that. Or we could just tap it as a land. And then just getting into the mana base on this, we'll just quickly go through lands because I really like some of the Fallout art. So like Command Tower Fallout art, like that's just really awesome. I don't usually like putting tap lands in decks, but 3 mana lands, I don't know of any that come into play on tap. So Zagoth Triumph, Opulent Palace. Of course, we also have our Moth guy in the art for Opulent Palace, so we could not include it. So going along with the theme of having lands that don't come to play tap, we have our shock lands, which we can also search out with the Farseek. And then we have our, they don't enter tap, you have 2 or more opponents, so most of the time they're not going to enter in tapped. If you control 2 or more of their lands, they don't come into play tapped. And then, yeah, if you control an island or swamp, forest or island, swamp or forest, you know, we got basic lands in this deck, so of course it's really easy for these cards not to come into play tapped. And then some cool Fallout art on the pay 1 tap, add 2 colors lands. Really like, had to include Exotic Orchard, another card that just comes into play, usually taps for whatever mana you want. And then to round it off, we got 4 forests, 4 islands, and 5 swamps. And of course, I had to choose the art where it has the dog in all of them because we love our dog. Alright guys, so that's the deck. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you liked the deck. Please leave a comment with any thoughts, opinions you guys have on the deck. What would you include in the deck? What would you take out of the deck? Do you think my harsh criticism of the Master Transcendent is valid? What kind of ways do you guys like to build decks? That's what I'm kind of interested in hearing. Again, any feedback would be appreciated. Also, make sure you like and subscribe the video. Really appreciate that. Let me know if you like these deck techs. You know, this is my first one on the channel. I would like to make more of them. So if this is something you like, let me hear about it. I can make more. If you have a specific commander you'd like me to build around that you'd be interested, like, hey, how would you build this commander? Let me know. I can make a video about it. Yeah, so that's kind of the way I want to build this channel up. So any support you guys give me, I'd appreciate it. But without any further ado, you guys have a good one, and we will see you in the next video.